Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Art is an embodiment of history. Then what truly happens when art is stolen? And in the modern conversation of stolen art, how relevant is it to mention the imperial plunder of art and artifacts? On tonight's show, we pick up on a global conversation regarding how art is trafficked and what is being done to counter this category of theft. We also explore the debate regarding the restitution of art back to the former colonized nations and how much of a political will is there amongst former colonizers to return this art. We welcome our guests to the show today. We're joined by Mr. Ratish Nanda, who is a noted Indian conservation architect and the project's director of Aga Khan Trust for Culture, joining us from Delhi. And we're also joined by Mr. Neil Walsh, who is a UN Chief of Cybercrime and Anti-Money Laundering, joining us from Vienna. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Walsh, let me begin with you. Can you just take us through the basics of how in modern society is art trafficked and how is it taken from one place to another?
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for giving us your time to speak on Indus Special today. I think like any criminality, irrespective of what the commodity is, one also always has to look at moving something from A to B. So we see criminals who offer the capability to move an object, a piece of art, in the same way that they traffic drugs or weapons or any other commodity. So sometimes that might be containerized, like going on ships or going across continents by road. But I think we have to look wider than that in the art field, that there are those specialists who enable art to be moved legitimately. And then we have to look at how that can be exploited, because criminals always look for the opportunity to exploit something that already exists.
Yeah. And can you tell us just if there is a figure out there that gives us a sense of how much art is trafficked on a yearly basis or in a couple of years? How much do organized criminals do to transfer this art? How much worth is it?
It's a really good question, and I quite honestly I don't have the answer to it. And the reason for that, like a lot of organized crime, is that it is hidden. It's done in a pseudo-anonymous way. And if we look at the risks of art being trafficked as a specific area of crime or an area of moving value, then often there are brokers involved who have the ability of anonymizing a transaction. So when we look at how things are anonymously moved or pseudo-anonymously moved, then it makes it really hard to try and put figures around it. And quite often we find trying to put figures on things like this can be unhelpful to the discussion, because we're really grasping a thin air. If we don't have a really good sense of the scale of the threat, a picture of the threat, then putting a figure behind it can be exceptionally difficult.
Yeah. And what kind of art is more vulnerable than other pieces in this art trafficking? Is it paintings that are usually the target, or what's happening here?
To call trade-based money laundering, which is basically the ability to move a commodity, but also how can you then change the price of that? Can you inflate how much something is worth? And by doing things like that, then we start to see how that price can change. So it's not necessarily the commodity itself, whether it's a painting or whether it's a statue or a piece of cultural heritage. It's how can that value be manipulated in order to allow criminals or terrorists to do their work.
Yeah. And with that, I want to take this question to Mr. Ratish Nanda, who has been involved in several restoration projects all over the world. Mr. Ratish, how do you think the price or the value of these artifacts can ever be pegged? Do you think there is any way to do so?
Well, when you start putting a value, you first have to identify the object. And a big problem in the subcontinent is that unlike Europe, we in India and Pakistan, I'm sure, do not have an adequate list of objects that are our national heritage, whether they are with us, whether they're abroad, and so on. I don't think the value can actually be given in numbers. I'm sure it can be in billions and billions and billions of dollars. But economic and financial value is not the only problem here. It's also emotional value, as the Chinese have shown again and again, where they have insisted that objects that are of huge cultural value, huge emotional value to the Chinese are returned there. And in India, similar efforts are being done, though privately, about getting important sculptures, idols, gods, goddesses that have been taken out illegally back to the India. So there is a huge amount of emotional value. There is a huge amount of pride, national pride occasionally, associated with objects that have continuously made their way to Europe and America.
Yeah. And Mr. Rich, let's build on to that point a little more. Tell us, when you're saying and talking about the emotional value of these, tell us how these artifacts, these art pieces help to build national identity.
Well, often for someone, an object is just a beautiful piece of art. For somebody in India, it might represent Lord Ganesha in a very special form, and which is spiritual. It needs to be venerated. It is worshipped. But when the object is taken away out of the context, it is simply a beautiful piece of art, even though it might have been done thousands of years ago by craft techniques that no longer survive, or would have taken a whole culture to do this over generations. So the critical point to understand is that art, one of the biggest objections is that such objects taken away out of their context are put in places where they're almost disrespectful. It's considered disrespectful. There is, of course, the other sort of object, which is, for example, the Koh-i-noor diamond, which is I'm sure contested by a lot of countries, but is sitting in the Tower of London, which the value of which is really financial. It's what it's worth. But also a diamond of that size to have been taken out from here, and a history and so on, it's changed many hands, and that history is no longer available to people who even see it in the Tower of London.
And Mr. Ratish Nanda, something that the critics of restitution always bring up is that art is supposed to be universal, and it's not supposed to be tied down to a specific locality. It should be enjoyed by everyone, because that's what unites people all across the world. How does that factor into this conversation, or do you think that that is an argument not worth exploring?
Well, it is true. It is true. A site is often called a World Heritage Site because it's the value of mankind as a whole. And similarly, clearly the reason for this whole industry, illegal industry, is because art created in one part of the world is as valued, if not more, in another part of the world. But the question is, the debate is, and the criticism is, how legal is that approach? How legal? Because we've in India recently arrested one or two major dealers or brokers who have systematically looted thousands and thousands of temples across India. Now, these temples have no security guards. They're usually managed by a community, which is a poor community. They don't understand the value. What might be worth $1 million outside might be in the ownership of a community that, between the whole community, doesn't earn $1 million in their whole lifetime.
Yeah.
So there is that bias which people exploit, and that is what is wrong.
Yeah. And Mr. Ratish, hold on to that thought. I do want to talk more about the historical value of art and it being placed in its context. But before that, I want to talk to Mr. Neil about what we have been talking about, the cultural importance of art being. Mr. Neil, you heard Mr. Ratish talk about how art has great cultural significance. What can you tell us about the international conventions out there that are aimed at protecting art from being misplaced or mislocated or taken away from its original locality?
Great question, Michelle. It's not my area of expertise talking about the international conventions on art per se, as I run the bit of the business that deals with countering money laundering and terrorist financing. But what I could add to that is that there are conventions in place and recommendations in place to help countries counter the money laundering associated with goods like that, such as the recommendations from the Financial Action Task Force, and there is the European Union's 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive. all of which help dealers and those who are moving and selling and relocating art to help ensure that commodity isn't used to move money illicitly on behalf of organized criminals or terrorists.
Yeah, and you mentioned here terrorist financing, and there is a lot of material that suggests that even ISIS uses art trafficking as a way to fund itself. Tell us about that. How much terrorism is funded through art trafficking?
Sure. Again, if we work from the premise that it's a hidden figure, that most of this movement of any illicit goods is very hidden in the size overall. But if I'm a terrorist or a criminal and I wish to move assets from one country to another, and let's imagine I'm a country that's under sanctions or I'm a terrorist group that's being looked at, well, if I can use art, then that might facilitate my ability to move or to gain money or to move profit in a really easy way. So let's imagine that a piece of art is priced significantly higher or lower than what it's worth, or a dealer doesn't go through their customer due diligence. They don't understand who they're dealing with. Or perhaps a customer insists on dealing it by using cash rather than using an international wire transfer in the way that we would normally expect, or the clients don't provide adequate information. All of these sorts of red flags or really big alert signs can make individuals who work in the trade or policing or intelligence or military aware of where some of this illicit profit may be going from. So it shows the necessity for countries to make sure that they have a strong, structured, responsive anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism regime in place.
Yeah. And we were talking about this earlier, but we talked about it in bits and parts. What makes art that you can't really place a value on it, and the value can often depend from person to person? But what makes it an easy vehicle for money laundering in this case when you can never really determine the value of art? Let's just emphasize on that point a little more and talk about it a little more, Mr. Neil Walsh.
I think that's hitting the nail on the head, Meshal. It's the fact that each individual will have a different perception of what a piece of art is worth. Maybe how much they would individually be willing to pay for it, maybe how much they feel a customer or another associate may be willing to pay for it. So if we look at that from the premise of wanting to launder money or criminal or terrorist finance using art, you can see potentially how easy that would be. That if you or I, let's say we both look at the same piece of art and we both have a different view on how much that's worth, then how do we start to identify when someone is illicitly trying to influence the price or the profit of the sale or the purchase of a piece of art? It's not like if we look at OPEC or we look at any of the standard oil, gas price markets where there is a fairly fixed price, or if we look at the price of gold, for example. But when we look at pieces like this, as you say, they are very subjective in how much one would be willing to pay for them. That's where we require real expertise from museums, from brokers, from those who are credible in the industry, and they can start to be a real part of the solution. Sometimes we would say they're part of the problem because they may be involved in facilitating the laundering of criminal or terrorist proceeds with art, but they're part of the solution as well. And I think we really have to look at the expertise that the industry can bring to government in helping to counter this threat.
Yeah. And when we're having this conversation, we're talking about non-state actors, we're talking about individuals and those who are involved in organized crime. But I want to ask you as a last question, are there any international conventions out there that recognize the artifacts and arts that were taken by countries, by states, illegitimately while they were ruling nation states during the colonial era?
Again, it's a great question, Meshal, but it's outside of my area of expertise. I work on the anti-money laundering, terrorist financing and cyber piece of the business. But I suspect the right people to ask from the UN would be in UNESCO, our cultural heritage people, and they could probably guide you further on that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you so much, Mr. Neil Walsh, for talking to us and shedding light on how art is trafficked all around the world. Mr. Ratish, going back to you, when we were talking about the restoration of art, What do you think happens to a society that's lived without a certain piece of art, or in your case, architecture, for so long without appreciating it, and all of a sudden it's reintroduced back into society? What do you think are the sentiments there, and what do you think is the value of that?
I think there are 2 or 3 points related to that. But just going back to your previous question to Mr. Neil, I think the law, there is international conventions and laws and so on, and there is international policing. But the critical aspect is national law. I mean, what does the law in India say? What does the law in Pakistan say? Now, these sometimes is also a problem, because in India, at least, if the law is also quite difficult for people in India who want to own antiquity themselves. And I think our countries also need to do a lot more about making it easier for antiquity to stay in. For example, also if somebody is going to gift Indian antiquity back to India, that is also taxed, which is silly, because somebody is saying, okay, this belongs to India, I'm sending it back, but the Indian government still chooses to tax it. I don't know what the law in Pakistan is.
What's the logic behind that there?
I don't know. Maybe there is no logic. Maybe this is a law which is sort of typically in our part of the world carried over from the
because you would think that
times.
you would think that you would want art to come back to its origins, as opposed to there being hindrances erected in order to prevent that from happening.
Yes, I'm sure there is a logic behind it which you and me don't see. I'm sure there is a logic. Maybe it's got something to do with money transfers. Maybe it's something to do with the Hawala racket. Maybe it's somebody sort of pretending that, okay, this art is coming back for free, but it's actually not because money has been paid illegally. I don't know. But what is absolutely critical is that we in India, going back from your question, are not able to invest and in displaying the same national art treasury for our own people the way, and at least not safekeep this in the same way as is being done in some of the European countries. So we need simultaneous action in creating new museums, in creating new attractions, specialized museums, which will have state-of-art equipment, state-of-art displays to display this antiquity. There is still a lot in our part of the world which is lying under wraps.
Yeah, right. Mr. Ratish, hold on to that thought. I want to start taking the conversation towards a more historical perspective, talking about a restitution of it. We're also joined by another guest, Mr. Anurag Saxena, who is an Indian activist, author, and commentator. He is the founder of the Indian Pride Project, which is a volunteer-led effort to bring back India's stolen heritage. Thank you so much, Mr. Anurag, for joining us. Give us a historical perspective. How much art, how much artifacts were plundered by the British from the subcontinent?
Well, honestly, our stand is that even one piece of heritage that you lose is way too many. Now, having said that, there are there are accounts of a few thousand pieces of heritage that have been taken away forcibly during the colonization era. And I'm sure there's a whole bunch of them about which there is no documentation whatsoever. Now, the United Nations, the Transparency and the Global Financial Integrity, each of them come up with their own accounts of the value of these items. But honestly, the way, our stand is that this is one of those crimes that just by putting a value on it is a criminal activity in itself.
So that's another important question, that it's one of those crimes. Those who are critics of restitution, returning back art, say that it is not a crime because there's no way to really determine whether that art was actually forcibly taken. It could have been given as presents to the colonizers back then. So when we can't determine how it was taken, is it really crime?
Well, honestly, look, there are two types of art or heritage, right? One is stuff that was known to be publicly owned in public institutions, in temples, in forts, in churches, what have you. The other that was privately owned. Now, I believe that the onus of proving the ownership should lie with the museums, with the private collectors who own the art today.
Yeah.
Rather than the ownership lying with somebody in India or in Pakistan or in Sri Lanka or Cambodia or wherever to prove that they owned it a couple of 100 years back. Now, theoretically, if it is an object that came from South Asia and it is found elsewhere today, it is akin to, let's say my hand phone or my mobile phone being found in your purse. It's your job to prove that you legitimately bought that hand phone from me.
Yeah.
Rather than me having to prove the trail of how it got stolen.
Yeah. Mr. Ratish Nanda, building on from what we just heard here, do you think in the global realm there is a fostering of a political will to return what was taken decades back?
Obviously, there is a huge reluctance, as Mr. Saxena has been at the forefront of trying to get some of these objects back and has successfully managed quite a few, which is great. I think a lot of very important museums would empty out if some of these objects are given back. I think it will be very difficult to find a solution that is on any of the extremes. I think somewhere a middle path needs to be brought back, whether, as has begun to happen, is through long-term exhibitions, some objects come back. In our case, a lot of examples of a particular kind of art, for example, Mughal painting. I think the best pieces are outside India, and many of them are lying in reserve collections and will probably never be shown in not only in our generation, but for the next 2-3 generations. So I think there is a problem of plenty in some cases, and the big problem, as Mr. Saxena just pointed out, I think what we need to do is very systematically also focus on building a listing, a reservoir, an inventory of objects that are available both within our countries as well as outside.
Yeah.
And this needs public-private partnership. It needs academic institutes as much as government, and it needs communities to be.
Yeah, Mr. Ratish, Mr. Saxena, who wants to add to the point you were making. Mr. Saxena, go ahead.
I absolutely agree with everything that Mr. Ratish just said. Now, the silver lining I see here is this. I think the narrative across the globe is kind of shifting with a bunch of activists who are essentially speaking the same language. And the message is very simple, as my friend Ananda Shankar puts it, that history belongs to its geography. I strongly believe that we are seeing almost a Rosa Parks moment, which is to say that something that was considered absolutely kosher, till let's say a decade back, will not be considered kosher a decade from now. And I think we're at that cusp. And I think very positive moves there. President Macron from France has already instituted a committee to start returning Ghanaian and African art from the colonial era. Jeremy Corbyn, the shadow prime minister in the UK, has already made a public statement last year saying if he were to come back to power, he would return the Parthenon marbles. And indeed, that opens the conversation to many other nations that would want to claim their heritage back. So I agree there are a lot of tactical issues on this, and there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen. But I'm glad that we are beyond the point where there were doors slamming on our face.
Yeah. Mr. Saxena pointed out that this is due to the efforts of many activists who are pushing for this to happen. What do you think has happened that has caused people to realize that they need to demand with a stronger voice for these things to be returned to them? Or do you think this is a recent phenomena, or it has been building up for quite some time now?
Well, it's very interesting. I think if you look at civilizational cultures, by civilizational cultures, I mean cultures that have existed for ages. It could be the Chinese, it could be the Indians, it could be South Asians, Africans. Each of us have been proud of our culture for the longest time ever, even before a lot of Western nations were born. I think what has happened recently is two things. One is there is a change in geopolitical dynamics in terms of diplomatic power, economic power, so on and so forth. So that's one thing that is changing. The second thing that is changing today is the narrative around fairness is building up. It has taken us a century to get rid of a lot of ills. It could be segregation, it could be women not having voting rights. It has taken us a century for the oppressed to find their voices on multiple topics. This is another category of oppressed that is now finding voice on something that we wanted to do for generations but haven't been able to.
Yeah. And that's a very strong point there. And before we take a short break, I just want to ask Mr. Ratish Nanda a last question here. Mr. Ratish, often this claim comes up that when you send back the artifacts and arts that have been going through such a careful preservation in European nations and Western nations back to their homeland, there's no assurity that the same level of preservation and care will take place. What can you tell us about that quickly before we take a short break?
Well, I think it is important here to segregate the kind of object that we're talking about. For example, stone, metal is much easier to preserve than, say, materials such as paper and wood. And I think if that should not be the hindrance between any object coming back ever, because today, by and large, there is enough money, expertise available the world over to ensure that any object considered to be of value enough to be brought back or to be sent back or to be fought for, I think that object would be well taken care of. Mr. Saxena just talked about the Parthenon marbles.
Yeah.
I think this was a point raised against the Greeks many, many years ago. The Greeks have in the meanwhile gone and built a whole museum which is waiting for the Parthenon marbles to actually come back.
Right. And thank you for that, Mr. Ratish Nanda, for clarifying that, shedding light on that. Thank you so much, Mr. Anurag Saxena, for joining us and talking to us about this. We're going to take a short break. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion regarding the restitution of art, now we're joined by Mr. Nigel Hetherington, who is the founder of the Past Preserver and an archaeologist joining us from Cairo. We're also joined by Mr. Khalid Albaih, who is a political cartoonist who describes himself as an ambassador for his native Sudan. Thank you both for joining us. On the issue of how much wealth and how much art was actually plundered from the subcontinent, let's take a look at something that Mr. Shashi Tharoor, who is an Indian politician, has to say.
The problem is that most of the London museums are chor bazaars. Pretty much everything in those museums has been purloined from the colonies that the British conquered and ruled. Heritage that you've taken away from here by right of conquest and nothing else, I think you need to return them. That's one concrete thing you can do.
Mr. Nigel, let's begin with you and let's talk a little about the Macron report that was released in 2018. That report found that almost 90% of Africa's arts and artifacts are outside of Africa. What can you tell us about the situation?
Well, it was a dramatic report and I think quite a big shock to the cultural and heritage worlds of the West and the Western museums, such as the Louvre and the British Museum. Their collections obviously are built from a previous era, and the artifacts obviously in there come from all around the world, including Africa and in Egypt, where I currently am. There is a big call for artifacts to be returned, particularly here. People are keen to have artifacts they seem as key to the story of their civilization. So we're talking about Nefertiti's bust and the Rosetta Stone, things that are key to telling the story of the past.
Tell us more about that word that you're using, the key to telling the story of the past. How are artifacts and art pieces a key to the missing puzzle piece, or, how do they tell a person more about their history?
Well, if I give the example of the Rosetta Stone, I think that's a wonderful example, and it's used quite a lot in this debate about repatriation. Until the discovery of this stone, which is basically a tripartite stone, so basically it's got 3 languages on one stone with the same text, and it was found in Egypt, actually by the French when they were here, and then seized by the British from the French. Now, because of that, the 3 scripts on that stone, they were able eventually to translate hieroglyphs. So until then, we just did not understand the Egyptian civilization at all. So that is incredibly important, artifact, a sort of linchpin in understanding the Egyptian past. So for the majority of Egyptians, they're never going to be able to actually see that, obviously, in the British Museum in London. And so many here feel that that should be in Cairo for the majority of Egyptians to be able to see.
And tell us about the struggle to repatriate and get back those artifacts, and especially what's happening in Egypt. You're saying that there is a very strong movement. What progress has Egypt seen so far?
Actually, Egypt has repatriated a lot of artifacts, and probably about 30,000 over the last 10 years. Obviously, some very, very small items and things that were stolen since 1972, when the law was passed on removing cultural objects from the country. So there's been a big success story here in getting a lot of their cultural patrimony back into the country. And they have a dedicated team at the Ministry of Antiquities who's responsible for that.
Yeah, and that's great. Let's bring Mr. Khalid into the conversation as well. Mr. Khalid, we heard Mr. Nigel talk about how certain artifacts are key to understanding a history. What I want to talk to you about is how history informs modern identity. How do you think that knowing more about your history through art is informing a person's modern identity in this day and age?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's a very important question, because coming from Sudan, which is one of the oldest civilizations in the world and has a lot of connections, of course, to Egypt and other surrounding countries. But our issue right now is that most of our history is not studied and was not studied. And there was a huge influx of studying Egyptology, but studying the Nubian history wasn't up to date. And this, I think, comes to a lot of, it tells a lot about the story where we are today as Sudanese people, because we don't know our story. We don't know where we come from. And the main issue in Sudan, there's always this argument about where do we belong? Are we East African? Are we North African? Are we Arab? Are we? So when we have some sort of a base to build from, I think it will really help us in the current socio-political situation as well. So it's studying your history, knowing your history. I think it's very important for the coming generations.
And Mr. Khalid, do you see that in the post-colonial world, retrieving back artifacts and art is a way of healing from the wounds that were inflicted from colonization? Is that something, a narrative you would subscribe to?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it makes sense, of course, for countries that have succeeded in studying and preserving the history that they've returned to actually own back their history, like the Rosetta Stone, like Nigel said. But for a lot of, for the countries that are unstable, I don't think it's the right move. Definitely not, because these artifacts, yes, belong to these countries, but they also belong to the world. And at the end, this is world heritage, and we should preserve that. So if the countries don't have the means to keep these artifacts safe and studied, and make sure that there's an ongoing restoration and so on, I don't think it's a good idea to have these objects back.
Mr. Khalid, here we were just talking to Mr. Nigel about that one point, and he mentioned a specific example. He showed how when an object is taken out of its geographical context, it often loses its meaning. So in this case, do you still think countries that aren't ready or aren't stable enough to receive history, their pieces of arts because they can't preserve it, should still be deprived of their own history?
No, I don't think they should be deprived of their own history. And I think now a lot of the cultural institutions I think, have the intelligence to figure out a way to collaborate, to bring back the work to the country, to make sure that the people understand their history and appreciate it, but in a way that this piece of work and these artifacts are preserved and they're not in danger. So I think some sort of a collaboration is not black and white. Some sort of a collaboration, I think, would do it justice, definitely.
Yeah. Mr. Nigel, it's more about that point that Mr. Khalid was making. What can you see on the international front in terms of collaboration in order to preserve art and in order to bring it back?
I mean, I'd just like to pick up on an earlier point about stability. It is a big issue, obviously, for many countries, but it is also used as a weapon against countries, against returning cultural objects. It was used for many years by Britain about Greece. Greece was said to be unstable, couldn't look after its cultural heritage, didn't know how to show and manage the Parthenon marbles. Yeah. And so, now that argument is seen as ludicrous. That Greece can't manage that. They have a wonderful museum ready and waiting for those objects to be returned. So it is a difficult one when you bring in stability, but obviously it is an issue because we also want to make sure that the cultural heritage is safe and protected. And I think there are lots of collaborations going on around the world now. The museums have changed dramatically. The institutions have changed in the West, and partnerships are the future. There's lots of loan agreements going on between museums, so objects come back to a certain country or they go on tour so people can actually see their heritage. But here, particularly in Egypt, there's a grassroots feeling that not all of it should come back, of course. I mean, you can imagine the amount of cultural material from Egypt around the world is immense. Yeah. But people also feel that they are ambassadors for Egypt. I mean, they do drive tourism to Egypt. They drive people to study Egyptian history. But there is this feeling that certain objects do belong in the mother country.
Yeah. Mr. Khalid, question to you. When we were talking about the fact that often it's a tool also used by former colonies against countries that they cannot preserve their artwork, how far do you think the global conversation has come, or how far do you think former colonizers have come to realize all the damage they've caused? Do you think there's a sense of realization that is coming forth from this movement to repatriate cultural objects?
Yes, absolutely. I absolutely think so. I mean, we're in the age of Me Too and the Black Power Black Lives Matter movement. So there's a lot of realization, not only in culture but in the whole social scene. And yes, I think there's a lot of institutions right now that are looking forward to these collaborations with the home countries and stuff. But as well as going back to the stability, I mean, you could see what happened in Iraq and in Syria today. Most of the artifacts, the first thing that was looted in Iraq was the museum. And these things disappeared. And they will probably show up 30 or 40 years from now because now they're with private collectors and so on. So this is another point that we should look at. It's not only the institutions, it's the private owners as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that point, Mr. Khalid Albaih, and talking to us. Mr. Nigel, picking up from that point that Mr. Khalid was making about the private collectors and how art disappears from museums, tell us about that. How common is that, in fact?
Well, obviously, if in situations like Iraq and Syria and everything, lots have disappeared, and this is organized crime, and these private collectors almost, sit with a catalogue, waiting to choose objects in countries where there is instability, where they can get access to the collections. It's deeply worrying, of course, that there's this demand and there's this money for these objects. And obviously we saw the terrorist organizations were involved in selling these objects. In one way, these organizations were destroying them because they were saying they went against their beliefs. But at the same time, if the object was portable and could make money, they would sell it to private collectors. So it fueled terrorism in the West. It also fueled wars around the world. So it's the antiquities appropriation and theft is part of a bigger problem.
Yeah. And Nigel, I know that this is a very complex issue and debate to have, but I do want to know your thoughts on it. Don't you think that when more developed nations claim that taking artwork from their native land or not giving back the artwork to the native land because you can preserve it better is also just echoing the same colonial perspective that existed before, that we can do it better?
Oh, absolutely. And if you look, again, another example from Egypt, because I know so much, more about Egypt than other countries, is Egypt is building regional museums throughout the country. Those museums are not aimed at foreigners. They're not aimed at tourists. They're aimed at telling the national story and the dialogue about the past to Egyptian people. So those museums, have to have important objects in for the Egyptian people to see. For too long here, tourism and sort of the cultural framework was about the West and to attract tourists. But there is another audience as well. There's the local audience, and that is important. And it is part of what was said before. It's part of their history. It's part of who they are now. The Egyptian football team, the national team, is called the Pharaohs. There is a deep-seated connection to the past here when you live in a country that's so old.
Yeah. We're also by Mr. Nikhil Singh Rajputt, who is an activist joining us from Delhi. Thank you so much, Mr. Nikhil, for joining us. Mr. Nigel was just making this point that the history and the cultural importance of artifacts still exists today in many different forms. Tell us that same point, but through the lens of the subcontinent. Tell us that from the perspective of South Asia.
India specifically is one of the biggest contributors in the illicit art trade that eventually lands up in the United States. And this is a fact of today. And this fact has not changed for good decades. And the proof of the pudding is if you visit any museum, you'll definitely find something which is either a Buddha statue or a Nataraja statue, as you would find Egyptian mummies. So I think our part of the world has been the biggest exporter, willingly, unwillingly, some of them legitimate, some of them illegitimate. So we are the biggest victim of that entire crime.
And Mr. Nikhil, you mentioned something interesting here, willingly or unwillingly, legitimately or unlegitimately. But what do you mean by willingly and legitimately?
So before 1971, you were allowed to export antiquities out of India. After, I think, 1971, and then that rule got implemented in India, I think, in 1976, which is a UN rule. And from there, the antiquity export was not allowed. Prior to that, you could export antiquities. So in that era, right from 1947 to the mid-70s, a lot of antiquities that were even stolen from the Indian temples or what have you went out legitimately because they could go out legitimately. So they filed for export, and then it just went.
Yeah.
But after 1976, a lot of antiquities have gone out. I mean, if you follow us, the activists in India, you'll see that every 7 days you will have a news where some temple has been raided, some antiquity has been stolen. So this is happening today.
Yeah.
And every week.
Yeah. Following from the point Mr. Nikhil was making here, Mr. Nigel, what do you think needs to happen in the international realm to bolster the laws against art trafficking and also to create a stronger global move towards the repatriation of art and artifacts?
I mean, on the art crime side of things, I'm not an expert on that, but I mean, obviously there are incredible work being taken by international organizations. There's a lot of coordination, particularly within the EU and other partners, and liaising with the countries, the source countries, to try and stop the flow. But it is a huge problem and also interconnected with organized crime and terrorism. So there are big agencies, involved in that. And I think basically the only way really is to stem the flow from the source countries.
Yeah.
But in terms of repatriation, I think the big thing with that, and it's happening all over the world, you see it now, museums returning objects in big, bold public statements. And I think it's more a sort of case of winning over hearts and minds. And when people understand why the Greeks want back the Parthenon marbles, when people understand the story of why the Egyptians feel that they're members of their royal families and things like that, royal mummies and things should be returned, or the Rosetta Stone should be returned. I think if people understand the reasoning behind it, the more of a movement in the Western countries to have those objects returned. So I think it's a case of public opinion changing as well.
Yeah. That is a very strong point to make there, Mr. Nigel, and it does echo the sentiments of many people who are in the post-colonial states who want to retrieve back pieces of their history. We're running short on time, unfortunately, but it was a great conversation to have with you, Mr. Nigel, and Mr. Nikhil Singh Rajputt, who joined us from Delhi. Thank you so much for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.